Welcome, everyone. Good morning. Thanks for joining us for this installment of the California Policy Forum. This forum is an ongoing quarterly webinar series co-presented by the Philanthropic California Coalition. That's Northern California Grantmakers, Southern California Grantmakers, and Catalyst of San Diego and Imperial counties. Also co-presented by the California Association of Nonprofits, aka Cal Nonprofits, and the League of California Community Foundations. I'm Laura Seaman, CEO of the League. We're a statewide coalition of 32 place-based hubs of local giving across California. We're very grateful for the leadership and partnership of Philanthropic California and of Cal Nonprofits on this collaborative series and on today's webinar, where we'll get an inside look at how the 2022 legislative and budget landscape is shaping up in Sacramento and what social sector organizations need to know about what's in store and how to engage. Thank you for taking time to come together with us today on this important topic. So let me go ahead and hand it over to our moderator for today's conversation. We're glad to be joined by Julian Cuevas, Director of Policy and Government Affairs with the Inland Empire Community Foundation. Over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura. Good morning, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us for this conversation on budgets and bills for this 2022 California legislative session. As Laura mentioned, my name is Julian Cuevas. I am the Director of Policy and Governmental Affairs for the Inland Empire Community Foundation, and most recently, the former Director of Government Affairs for the California Department of Education. And I'll be your moderator for today. But before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to take a moment to help set the stage for our dialogue this morning. Now, I know there's a lot of policy wonks on the call this morning. So as you all, I'm sure, are familiar with, about every 2 years, we have these policy wonks that say that the upcoming election is going to be an exceptional one. But I promise you, after today's conversation, you're going to see that this year truly is going to be an exceptional election year. For starters, although California is the first state to roll out an endemic plan, we're still going to go into 3 years, or the third year of restrictions, third year of anxieties, and of course, a third year of uncertainties. However, it is because of COVID-19 that we're still seeing funds from the American Rescue Plan being funneled to states and local governments. And it's because of COVID-19 that we're seeing unprecedented back-to-back budget surpluses here in the state of California. I mean, this year's budget surplus alone is an estimated $45.7 billion. This surplus is so large that it could trigger what is known as the Gan Limit. Now, I'm sure there are a lot of experts on this call, but high level, the Gan Limit is a proposition that was approved by California voters with the goal of keeping state and local government spending capped at 1978 and 1979 levels, which means that a portion of the surplus could actually be returned back to you, the taxpayers. Couple that with inflation, and of course, you have yourself a doozy, right? And that's not even considering bills. As many of you know, thousands of bills have already been introduced, as they are every year. And as spot bills become more content bills, we'll begin to see the legislature's 2022 vision come to light. There will be competing priorities that will likely be, once again, relatively inundated with COVID-19 recovery proposals. And with the constituency fatigued with everything COVID, it makes for a rather challenging campaign ahead. So, which brings me to my final point, redistricting. This will be the first election year with the new redistricting in effect. Projections are currently showing that nearly a quarter of state Senate and Assembly seats will be occupied by new legislators. I mean, that will fundamentally reshape the political landscape. And it's interesting, the newly drawn districts have pitted many elected officials against each other, forcing many to resign rather than compete with their respected friends and colleagues. And although this poses some challenges, there are projections that are also showing that the newly drawn districts are more representative of our diverse state and is likely to produce more candidates and elected officials of color. So, as I mentioned, year 3 of COVID-19, a record-breaking budget surplus, the Gan Limit factor, inflation, bills, and redistricting, this is going to be an exceptional election year. And with funny season already here, things are about to get interesting. So with that said, why don't we go ahead and bring in our panelists and begin the conversation. Joining us today, we have Essie Hutchful, the policy analyst of California Budget and Policy Center. We have Jennifer Fearing, principal of Fearless Advocacy and a Sacramento-based advocate for Cal nonprofits, and Mary Collins of Just Transition Program Manager at the California Governor's Office of Planning and Research. The way things are going to shake out this morning is that each of our presenters will have approximately 10 minutes to present. After each presenter, we'll field some relevant questions, as Laura had mentioned at the top of the hour, to the topic that was covered. And then we'll field some further questions after all of our presenters have presented. And so to help me field these questions, I'll be joined here and there by Lucy Salcido-Carter, the Public Policy Director at Cal Nonprofits. So if you have any questions you'd like to ask, please put them in the chat and we'll go ahead and get to them as quickly as we can. And so with that said, we'll go ahead and start with Essie, who will discuss a bit of her take on the state budget. So Essie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Julian. And thanks to you all for the invite. Good morning, everybody. As mentioned, my name is Essie Hutchful. I'm a policy analyst at the California Budget and Policy Center. Very happy to speak to you all today, particularly as I realize just now that my entire career has been in one form or other working at nonprofits. So this is really kind of my space. So the way I'm going to structure my remarks today, I'm going to try to keep it to 10 minutes, is first I'm going to give an overview of the budget process and where we are in that process. Then I'm going to touch on the governor's proposal, and then note some concerns moving forward on the horizon. So as you may know, on January 10th of this year, the governor released his proposed state budget for the 2022-23 fiscal year. And that will begin on July 1st of this year and end on June 30th of the next year, 2023. Now, this spending plan, this proposal, just reflects the governor's vision for California. Everything in that plan is really just a starting point for further conversations. And it's not really the end of the story. Right now, the legislature's budget committees have already begun to dig into the governor's proposals and are holding and will continue to hold public hearings in the weeks ahead. Now, these budget hearings provide an opportunity for legislators and for advocates for the public to comment on the governor's proposals and to advance their own ideas about what the budget should look like for the upcoming fiscal year. Beyond these budget hearings, the governor will then unveil a revised budget proposal in mid-May. And after that, the process is really going to move much faster at sort of warp speed because state leaders are going to work to finalize the outcomes of the budget package in June. So there is a lot that can and will change between now and June. And just as in the regular sort of policy bill process, in this budget process, the public's voice matters, your voice matters, and there will be a lot of opportunities to push for your values and priorities to be reflected in the state's spending plan. So with that sort of context and sort of timeline positioning out of the way, I want to get now into the actual proposal and estimates that the governor provided in January. So the administration projects another year of robust, stronger than expected revenues. And this is due to the fact that despite the really devastating effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, the state has actually experienced unprecedented revenue growth due to factors that include surging incomes among the wealthy, a booming stock market, and steep growth in corporate profits. So the governor estimates that total general fund revenues before transfers such as to the state's rainy day fund will be about $197.6 billion in this upcoming budget year. So great, we have a lot of money coming in. We're sort of very flush with cash, but we have to remember that the state has these huge needs that preceded the pandemic and that were built on inequitable structures that ensured and exacerbated the disproportionate effects of this pandemic on low-income households, and particularly people and communities of color. So that's just a reminder, right, that the recovery for many Californians and industries is on a much longer timeline, despite what we might talk about economic recovery and all these high revenues. We still have needs that require significant new and ongoing investment. So the way the governor has chosen to respond to that is by proposing spending for a series of emergency investments to respond to the public health effects of COVID-19, and a combination of one-time and ongoing investments to provide greater support for the health and economic well-being of Californians. Now, I'm not going to go into all, it would be impossible for me to go to all of these proposals in detail, and I will share a more detailed, the Budget Center's more detailed look at the governor's proposals in our first look resource. We'll share that in the chat. Right now, I just want to give a very high level overview of a few of those major proposals. They include providing comprehensive Medi-Cal for Californians who are undocumented and ages 26 to 49, to sort of finally end the long-standing xenophobic exclusion of undocumented Californians from Medi-Cal. $2.7 billion to improve the state's COVID-19 testing capacity, and also to increase vaccination uptake. And the governor envisions working in partnership on this with ethnic media outlets and community-based organizations in order to provide information about COVID-19 vaccines and boosters. The governor also proposes providing cash assistance for low-income Californians through state tax credits. So that includes a proposal that we're really excited about to end racist and sexist work requirements in the Young Child Tax Credit, and also a proposal to provide $1,000 on tax credits to former foster youth. That would be about $20 million annually. There's $4 billion coming in with a B, coming in to invest in homelessness prevention and housing, $150 million one-time aid for small businesses, which I want to note, 20 million of that is actually carryover from money that was set aside for nonprofits and cultural institutions in last year's budget, that the governor is saying that 20 million has been unallocated, sort of unclaimed, and so he's reallocating that to small businesses. There's also a lot of other funding, including in behavioral health and across education systems, from early learning to K-12 and higher education. So that's just a very, very high level look at some of the governor's proposals. However, the governor's plan isn't a complete response to what is needed right now, though there are some encouraging signals in that spending plan. It isn't a full response. There are still missed opportunities, especially given the devastating impacts of the pandemic on families and individuals across the state. So some missed opportunities include in housing and homelessness. I mentioned that there's $4 billion coming in, but a lot of that actually all of that is one time. And so there's a lack of long-term investments at scale to expand the supply of affordable housing and to address the homelessness crisis in our state. In cash assistance, there's a missed opportunity to commit to ensuring that CalWORK's cash assistance grants are above the deep poverty threshold for all children. And then in one big area for us is in childcare. As many of us know, childcare providers, many of which are nonprofits, really stepped up during the pandemic to provide vital care for children so that our economy could keep going. And we had hoped to see more support for these providers. However, the proposal does not continue waiving family fees for childcare for working parents, or continue to support providers when the virus impacts attendance or forces them to temporarily close. Another big gap is that while last year's budget agreement included a long overdue increase in payments, the rates those payments that increase was based on were outdated before Governor Newsom signed the bill. So we had been hoping to see continued increase in payment rates for childcare providers, and that is still outstanding. We'd also hoped the governor would take the opportunity to declare racism a public health crisis at the state level. We'd seen how much it has exacerbated the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on our communities. And that would also allow the governor to establish a dedicated fund to better support the nonprofits and community-based organizations, clinics, and tribal organizations that are on the ground in their efforts to advance health equity. And then just sort of more broadly speaking, a lot of this budget is, a lot of the spending is one time instead of ongoing. And that can be particularly difficult for community organizations, for nonprofit groups who sort of may struggle to sort of plan out their services further in advance without clear commitment from the administration about ongoing funding in their areas. But, so I just mentioned, all these missed opportunities, but as I said earlier, we're in a process right now between now to the May revision, or really to June, that give advocates and legislators the opportunity to address these gaps, to push for additional urgent and ongoing investments as part of this year's spending plan. So there's a lot of reason for optimism about the budget this year. But, and I want to end here because I'm coming up on time, there's a lot of reason for concern. So as Julian already mentioned, there's this big unknown that's known as the Gan Limit, which is an arbitrary spending cap that was put into the state constitution in the late 70s. And it restricts how we can use tax revenues and how we can spend towards our budget priorities for all future generations of Californians. And the reason it's a problem is because it favors some kinds of spending, such as infrastructure, over ongoing, more people-focused investments such as childcare and healthcare or homelessness. And it constrains our ability to maintain current services that we have, as well as to invest in bold policy solutions in the future. So what this means sort of practically is that when we exceed the limit, as we likely have in the past 2 years and will again, either those revenues, sort of without any sort of flexibility, must be allocated through school payments and taxpayer rebates, or the only sort of other flexibility allowed under the Gan Limit is to try to avoid our revenues exceeding the limit to begin with, which means that if there's a budget proposal that you want to support, or a legislation with a high price tag that you want to support, it really kind of has to either fall in the category of infrastructure spending or spending that is directly related to the COVID-19 state of emergency, or to something that sort of like a tax credit can reduce revenues. Otherwise, any proposal really faces a major obstacle to getting through the budget this year. And indeed, some of the governor's proposals may well require sort of paring back. The legislature has already signaled its intent to continue to try to work within the Gan Limit, with the Senate Budget Committee saying that its values will be to try to maintain ongoing spending in healthcare, the safety net, and higher education. So all of that means that right now is a really critical time for advocates to really be making their voices heard for their specific priority areas, and making the case for why that this matters for California. So to sum up, and I'm sorry I've gone a little bit over, we're really facing an oddly disconnected set of budget realities right now. We have an economy that in aggregate, at least for those at the top, is performing really well, and thus is bringing in a lot of high near-term revenues at our disposal. But we've got these limitations in terms of how are we able to use this funding, and are we able to commit to ongoing funding, or do we have to stick to one-time investments? And legislators and advocates are going to have to look to address these needs either through the budget or through the policy bill process. But either way, these restrictions are going to have critical implications for any proposal that will require significant spending and will be a concern for years to come. All right, thank you. That's little over 12 minutes. I apologize.
I'm sure it's completely worth it, Essie. Thank you so much for going through a very complex topic in like 12 minutes. I mean, that's a skill set right there, right? So thank you so much. I'm going to turn real quick to Lucy, who's going to be helping me. We're going to be tag teaming the Q&A segment here and see if we have a question teed up for Essie.
Yes, we've got a few questions. I guess I'll start, Essie, since you were talking about that there are opportunities and that it really makes sense for nonprofits to be engaged. Can you just mention a few ways that nonprofits, given as you know that we have very limited capacity and time, that we can be engaging in the legislative portion of the budget process? What are some strategies, quickly that we can, without being able to devote our full time to it, engage in the process?
Right, that's a great question, because of course there's many different ways and I guess levels of investment that you could sort of dedicate, from more high impact, sort of actually going, hitting the ground, sort of lobbying all the time. But if you don't really have a whole lot of capacity to do that, one great way is, so I mentioned the assembly, the legislatures budget committees, that they're going to be holding these budget hearings from now through the rest of the cycle. So one, and all five. Are we back?
You're back.
I lost you and you lost me. Okay. All right.
You were about halfway through your response and then you froze on us.
Okay. All right. So I'm just going to say that there are, for different issue areas, for example, health and human services, public safety, et cetera, each will have their respective budget subcommittee in the Senate and the Assembly. So a really great way of sort of making your voice heard is to see, and they publish their hearings and when they're going to have them, who's going to speak, to sort of just find the one that is specific to your interest area, and even just to call in and to voice your support or opposition to a proposal, so that you don't have to. That's sort of maybe the lower capacity way that I can think of voicing your support for something, is just to hop onto a hearing for a day and just call in and say, I am so-and-so from such organization, and we really want to express our support for XYZ proposal, or say we need more funding somewhere else or something like that.
Great, and we had a question related to it, so I just want to follow up quickly. So people can find out where those hearings, or when those hearings are happening, and how they can get on by getting online to the committee's websites. Is that the best way to do that?
Yes, and I will, when my portion of speaking is done, I will get those links and I'll put them in the chat for folks.
Wonderful. I see another question. Julian, did you have one, or should I go ahead?
I do have one, actually.
Great.
So I don't, not to get too caught up in the weeds, Essie, but I'm curious, right? I mean, the governor and the state legislature, I'm sure, have some tools that they're able to use, given just how unprecedented this situation is with how much of a surplus we have. Given that, we do have the Gan Limit, written into the Constitution, is there anything that they can do to not necessarily work around it, but just given, again, the unprecedented nature of what we're dealing with at the moment, is there anything that they're able to trigger to ensure that those funds could be expended in a way that most communities would like to see it expended? Right.
Yeah. So because this Gan Limit is now a part of our state constitution, in the longer term, in order to address it, voters would have to really decide to reform or repeal it. The legislature could someone could put that on the ballot or something. But for now, while it's still a part of our lives, and I went through this really quickly, so I'll do the slower version of it right now, is we have, sort of broadly speaking, three ways to try to address this Gan Limit, to try to avoid the trigger of exceeding it, right? The first is if a proposal falls into a category of a sort of exclude. So there's certain types of spending that in the eyes of the Gan limit are okay. So it doesn't really, it sort of closes its eyes to them and says, carry on, you can keep going. One type of spending is infrastructure. So if you have a proposal that maybe, for example, is for increasing housing, that counts as infrastructure. So that kind of spending can operate without being sort of dinged by the Gan limit. There's also anything that can be credibly linked to the COVID-19 state of emergency can also be considered permissible spending. And then the third category is any kind of proposal that helps us reduce revenue. So that would be something like a tax credit. So for example, if there are proposals to either introduce new tax credits or to expand existing tax credits, such as the Young Child Tax Credit or the California Earned Income Tax Credit, that would also work. So, but it's sort of a bit of a balance, right? There's some ways where a proposal sort of naturally is and should be a tax credit, and so that's fine. But then you might see some people be kind of tempted to try to take something that should be a regular sort of program spending and try to like finesse their way into making it a tax credit to make it more attractive, which could just be unfeasible, bad policy. But yeah, so those are the three ways to try to be flexible within the Gan limit.
Thank you for that, Essie. We appreciate that. I'm sure there are so many more questions. We could literally spend the rest of this meeting here or this forum talking about this, but there are two other presenters. So Essie, we'll probably see you in a few minutes when we get to the Q&A segment toward the end, but thank you so much for your presentation. Next, we're going to jump to Jennifer Fearing, who will be discussing a bit about bills and provide us a host of examples for us to review. So Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Well, good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I'm coming to you live from Sacramento, just a couple of blocks away from the California State Capitol. I'm pleased to be joining you. I run Fearless Advocacy, a small lobbying firm that's devoted to advancing causes that we believe in, and we're particularly privileged to represent Cal Nonprofits as their Sacramento advocate, and also the California Association of Museums and Meals on Wheels California, two other statewide associations of nonprofits, along with a host of other individual nonprofits that advocate for the environment, environmental justice, food access, etc. So I'm excited to be with you, and I'm totally going to cheat today and stray from just bills because of the unique circumstance of the budget, as you just heard from Essie. Advocates like me have been encouraging our clients to think very much about focusing on budget efforts and pairing legislative efforts with budget pushes this year to try to take maximal opportunity, be maximally opportunistic and the opportunity, of the funds that are available, notwithstanding the Gan limit issues. We've got to lean way in and look for resources to support our causes and our communities. So I'm actually going to share a couple of slides that I created today. If my internet struggles to do video and sharing screen, I'm going to drop my video for this purpose. Let me get this started. Just quickly on the ledge process, I'm just flashing this helpful infographic, which is my version of how a bill becomes a law and the important questions that I think ought to be asked by any advocate, sort of going from idea to bill to law. And so we'll offer this. I'm offering this as a link to you all. Someone will drop a link to the PDF to this chart. But I encourage you, as you step into this space, or if you're already in this space, to make sure you're really considering questions that come up throughout the process from the initiation of your effort, to make sure you have the best opportunity to succeed. We'll also drop a couple of more links. The last couple of years have been a rich time for the development of very practical tools for advocates interested in getting more engaged in the legislative and budget process in California, including a relatively new textbook written by practitioners here in Sacramento on how to engage in the regulatory and legislative process. And I contributed a chapter for nonprofit advocates to that. We'll drop links to those. And then if you are not at all familiar with Boulder advocacy, I just want to commend their California resources for advocacy to all of you, whether it's the kind of legal questions you might have about how to get involved in the legislative process or specifics. They are just an incredibly valuable resources. Almost all of their tools are available for free. So moving on to some things I want to highlight today. Last month, the joint select committee, so then each house, the Assembly and the Senate, there are select committees on the nonprofit sector, which Cal Nonprofits is very proud of having helped get going over the last couple of years. Senator Monique Lamone created the first select committee of the nonprofit sector when she was in the Assembly, and then has established one in the Senate when she was elected there. And then Assembly member Luz Rivas is now the chair of the Assembly Select Committee. And after kind of a COVID-related hiatus on holding informational hearings, we had an unbelievably high energy, powerful conversation that I hope some of you were able to attend or would be able to listen to last month, really trying to dive into what we learned about how nonprofits engaged with our state government during the pandemic, and our ways that relationship needs strengthening and improvements. And what I've put here in this slide are some of the themes that emerged across that conversation that was held. And also we'll drop a link in the chat to a brand new, literally finalized moments before I came on screen, kind of 3-pager that includes links to all the testimony that was provided at that event, as well as these themes and the specific recommendations that emerge. We will be sharing that with the entire legislature, and also urge each of you to look over that document and provide feedback if you think we've missed the mark somehow. But I feel like this is a moment. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Great. So I'm not sure, I said we had a hearing. These are the themes that emerged. We heard about it in the hearing, and Cal Nonprofits is hearing about it, and I'm hearing about it across my clients, that collectively we are all concerned about the workforce shortages we all face, the undercapitalization of our sector across the state, but the inequitable distribution of our assets and services in various parts of the state, and big nerves about a funding cliff that many of us will face as COVID-19 relief funding, both from the government and philanthropic sources, starts to fall off while the demand for our services continues to climb. Our need for more flexibility, fewer barriers, and more support in our work with the government, and our need for programs like when they are created to engage with us, that to speak our language. So I can't see the chat, but I am guessing there's a lot of +1s and snaps because these are definite themes that are coming through loud and clear across our sector. In keeping with that, Cal Nonprofits has been convening recently with a number of you who I see present today, and other nonprofits who have really want to work collaboratively to figure out ways to provide specific feedback to the state government for improving their relationships with us, both in contracting and with covering kind of mandated expenses. So I've tried to summarize those here, and in the interest of time, I won't be going into these in any detail, but again, look for more from Cal Nonprofits as we roll out with colleagues and engage with our members on ways we want to pursue much more flexibility, much more support for the real cost of providing services to the state, and the real cost of providing living wages to our employees to be able to recruit and keep the best talent. And lastly, similar to something or in keeping with what Essie just said, when mandates for additional COVID supplemental leave, which we strongly support from a policy perspective, come through the state, we need the state to provide resources to us to ensure that we can comply with that new leave requirement in ways that don't force us to cut our services. And so we are pursuing, for example, a payroll tax relief that would allow us to keep with that Gan limit concern, but also try to get resources out to every nonprofit with 25 or more employees that's now providing that additional leave to their employees. Moving on quickly, since this was advertised as being about bills, there are a number of bills. We just reached a deadline a couple weeks ago. Close to 2,000 bills have been introduced in the 2022 session, and we are still digging through them all. You can check out any of them you like yourself at leginfo.ca.gov, but Cal Nonprofits has taken a pass through the existing bills and identified a handful that affect the sector broadly, undoubtedly you would find bills that would affect your organization or your subsector. So I encourage you to kind of peruse those. And your first step would be to reach out to an author's office if there's any questions, issues, or concerns, or if you just want to see a fact sheet and know more what they have on their mind, where they're headed with a bill. But flagging these bills that Town Nonprofits has yet to take a position on, but it's taking.
We can hear you again.
Okay. SB 834, Senator Wiener is trying to take action against nonprofits who engage in insurrections. We have a few questions about how to address that while we understand the goal of it. AB 1664 aims to extend the nonprofit security grant program indefinitely. AB 2423 is a creative program designed to make the process of getting specialty license plates, which often support nonprofit interests. We're still taking a look at that one. And then Mr. Nazarian has a bill aimed at creating a correction to a bill that passed last year that required youth-serving organizations to have mandated reporters present when adults are interacting with children. Again, all these things would fall into the category, which is a typical category for legislation that we look at, which we often agree with the goal and the objectives, but sometimes the way it's drafted or the implementation and how it would be felt on the ground poses challenges that we want to try to address in the lawmaking process. So as I mentioned, there are a bunch of budget related efforts as well. And we're gonna drop some links to these and follow up with an email with them all, because I couldn't possibly do service to all of the amazing kind of coalitions of nonprofit advocacy organizations who all, by the way, would welcome additional support and engagement by other nonprofits in these broad bucket areas. I assure you, Essie described some of them. Some of these have governor's proposals that are already part of the governor's budget and being discussed by budget subcommittees with robust engagement by nonprofit advocates. And others have been proposed by advocates or are being pushed by legislative champions. And so we'll drop some links, but there is a push for at least $100 million to establish a California Health Equity and Racial Justice Fund in the arts and culture realm. Essie mentioned that the governor wants to swipe $20 million from the Nonprofit Cultural Institution Relief Program. Not on our watch. We are working to ensure that that funding stays in the sector. Senator Laird will soon be introducing or amending a bill to update the museum grant program and pairing that with a $125 million legislative budget proposal for our museums. And then California Arts Advocates is also pursuing some important budget priorities, including a general fund support, which they'd love to see California have at least $1 per person invested in the arts every year. Under the food access category, Senator Skinner has established herself as a big leader in the food access space, particularly.
Maybe take off your slides, Jennifer, if you think that's impacting.
Okay, I will try that. Nourish California and the California Immigrant Policy Center are also working on a number of important proposals, including pushing the governor's Food for All proposal. Again, we can drop links to these or provide them as a follow-up. And in the last couple, I'll just speak quickly, given time. There are big proposals by our friends at the Area Aging Agencies and Meals on Wheels California to make sure that California has got proper amounts of ongoing funding to keep up with the pace of the increased numbers of older Californians, particularly vulnerable older Californians who are in need of nutrition and other supports as we head out of the pandemic. And then lastly, the climate adaptation and community resilience. California is blessed with some incredible environmental justice organizations who are building and co-powering with communities in the Central Valley, the Imperial Valley, and beyond to make sure they're lifting up the need for community resilience centers, for access to resources to weatherize and cool and heat their homes and achieve tenant protections. And then we're also really pleased at Cal Nonprofits that the governor's budget includes funding for the California Department of Financial Protection and Innovation that includes some more outreach within our sector on the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. Cal Nonprofits recently held a webinar and more than 3,000 people registered to attend that. So we know this is a critical need within our sector. I've given short shrift to major subsectors like housing and homelessness, which of course the governor, legislature, and advocates have proposals running the gamut from changing laws around conservatorship, changing development and zoning laws to get more affordable housing and just housing writ large. expanded, and significant funding to address the homelessness crisis. So if you saw on my slide before it dropped away an asterisk of please don't be mad if your issue wasn't raised. It's always dangerous to lift things up because of what you leave out, but rest assured I shared what I felt most confident knowing about, but would be happy to connect any of you with broader efforts within your subsector if that would be helpful. And I'll just wrap with that.
Perfect. Thank you, Jennifer. And thanks for helping muscle through some of those tech glitches. Don't worry, we heard everything. We just had to back it up like 10 seconds and then start all over again, but we're good. There is a question that did come up. And so, and I know Lucy's going to help. I think there's other questions that are coming through that Lucy's monitoring. So, the reality is that most nonprofit organizations are just don't have the capacity to engage in the legislative process. Maybe they're just too small, or they just don't have the infrastructure in place for that. Do you have any recommendations, best practices on how nonprofit organizations, and I'm sure many of them are on this call, that say, how do you intentionally but effectively engage in this process so that their voices are being heard in such important issues like the ones that you just mentioned this morning?
Well, they don't pay me to say it, but I believe it. You should join Cal Nonprofits, number one. You should join any regional or statewide association. Really encourage joining any statewide association or regional association that has advocacy as part of their work. We are all stronger together, and we have more resources when we work together. I know that NorCal and SoCal grant makers also have a lot. They're investing in advocacy and keeping people informed about what's going on in Sacramento. So I definitely propose dipping that toe. That chapter that I mentioned that you can download for $5, which doesn't come to me, it goes to fund scholarships. That has some specific information for nonprofits who are interested in engaging at different levels of available capacity as a follow-up.
Perfect. Thank you, Jennifer. Lucy, you got anything on your end?
Yeah, a few things, but maybe we'll just take one now. We had a question about fact sheets. Jennifer, could you just explain what fact sheets are and the easiest way for people to get them?
Sure. Well, every office, when they introduce a bill, there is a kind of culture at the Capitol that they create a 1 to 2 page fact sheet that sort of says, this is what this bill is, this is the problem it's trying to solve, this is the solution that we have in mind, and here's who supports it and how to contact us. So within a couple of days of every bill showing up, it's reasonable for you to just pick up the phone and call that office and ask to have a copy of that fact sheet emailed to you. It can give you a lot of that good foundational information to pair with the bill language to provide it a little context. So it's a common kind of feature. I wish they were more readily available. The advocates keep pushing the legislature to figure out how to format a page on every legislator's website that just lists all their bills and a link to all their fact sheets, and a girl can dream. But in the meantime, we each just keep asking for them as we go.
You say fact sheets and my anxiety kicks in. That's great. Thank you, Jennifer. And I also want to acknowledge, I don't know how many people are familiar, but that infographic that you provided at the beginning of your presentation on the legislative process, like I can truly appreciate that. Anyone who's ever seen the original infographic knows like you have no clue which way the arrow is going. It's so complex and there's so many steps, but your infographic made it so much easier to digest, and it gave me hope that one day we'll fully understand the entire process here in California. So with that in mind, unless there's another question, Lucy, that's really pressing, we might be able to save it for after, if that works. Just I know we're going to come up on time, and just so everyone knows, this is going till 11:15. So we will have ample time after the next presenter to still field many of the questions that you all have. We want to make sure we're attending to those. So with that in mind, thank you, Jennifer. Who we have next is Mary Collins, who will be discussing a bit about the Community Economic Resilience Fund, which is one of the hottest topics right now in the state of California. And she is going to give us a rundown a bit on what she knows and what she's willing to share. So hi, Mary, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And I'll try to share slides, and if that doesn't work, I'll go with no slides. I want to make sure that we're moving along, and you know, I often have a lot of tech challenges too. So I totally feel you, everyone else who's been having them today. So, and I will say, so let me just start off by introducing myself. So my name is Mary Collins. I'm a program manager at the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. I work on initiatives and programs related to moving our economy to one that's more sustainable and equitable. And the main thing that I work on is the Community Economic Resilience Fund. You know, before getting into that, I will note that I was expecting to hear a little bit about the governor's proposal for the Office of Community Partnership and Strategic Communications, which is not something that I personally work on, but that was a proposal in the governor's budget to kind of manage resources through formal infrastructure and supporting the role of community-based organizations as trust messengers in their communities. So I just wanted to flag that because that might be something that's of interest to you all. But my main work is the Community Economic Resilience Fund. And this was passed in actually last year's, sorry about that, passed in last year's budget. And it was SB 162. Can you guys see my screen okay?
Yes, we can see it.
Awesome, great. And so this was SB 162. And I'll get into kind of some of the more recent legislative updates here in a moment. But this was part of last year's May revise and was funded with American Rescue Plan Act programs. So first, I just want to go over a couple of the basics of the SURF program, some of the context, some overview, and then I'll tie it up with some more recent legislative updates to kind of thread the needle with the theme of this year's you know, legislative season. So real quickly, in terms of who is on the SURF program, SURF is actually, even though I'm from OPR and we're one of the lead agencies, we work hand in glove with two other agencies, including Labor and GoBiz. And so we're led by the three different directors, my director Samuel Seifa, the director of GoBiz, D.D. Myers, as well as Secretary Palugii of the Labor Department. And the Community Economic Resilience Fund really came to be due to a lot of the issues in our economy right now. So a lot of other states, they might have a roadmap forward for the state's economy, but a singular roadmap for our economy doesn't really make sense in terms of planning ahead because we're the world's fifth largest economy. We have a lot of regional diversity, and so the kind of competitive advantages, challenges, opportunities might vary in each region, and so the solutions are going to look really different, you know, in somewhere in North State versus Kern County versus Los Angeles. And we know that economies really happen at the regional level, especially as we think about things like industries, talent pools, innovation assets, and supply chain. And so as we've talked about COVID-19, it's really shown a light on the inequities in facing our economy. You know, both COVID, climate change, these different crises that we face disproportionately impact people of color, and have really starkly exposed the inequities that exist in our systems, like access to health, jobs, education, economic opportunities. And we know these didn't happen by accident, right? These are a result of decades of government and private sector policies that have systemically facilitated these inequities. And so this lens of what we've really seen front and center in the pandemic, not being able to go back to that. The other thing that really formulates why SURF, why now is the transition to carbon neutrality, planning for a resilient economy, and preparing for these changes, looking ahead, go hand in hand. We've got some regions that are dependent on one legacy industry for tax revenues, and then we've got other industries that are kind of shifting and changing across the state. So this is kind of some of the framing of why SURF, which ties into some of our program objectives that we have. So we want to promote Regions Up approach to economic resiliency, equity, and sustainable growth. And we want to promote inclusive planning. So this is really a first of its kind approach for a program at this scale, because we really need the perspective of community members, local workers, and because we really believe that inclusive planning is a pathway to equitable outcomes. And in our conversations with different entities, such as nonprofits, people across the state told us that they wanted to have a voice in planning for their economic future. And so here we are here trying to build these different regional plans together with different voices who haven't been at the table together. Another one of our objectives is to really align federal, state, philanthropic, private capital funding, for these different investments that are coming down the pipeline. So we've gone over kind of the team, the why, some of our objectives, and just a quick overview of our program. So we've got two different phases of the Community Economic Resilience Fund, or SERF. The first will be planning. So it's going to establish 13 different regional collaboratives that will receive $5 million to go over inclusive planning process, to really lead inclusive planning processes, and develop regional resilience and transition plans that really meet regions where they are. That will include a lot of different technical assistance from our side, as well as the ability to contract with researchers and be able to ensure that we are doing not only the inclusive processes, but making sure that these plans are rooted in fact in science. And so after the first phase, where we have the inclusive planning processes, where we have different representatives from throughout the region, one of the outputs from that is a suggested list of investments throughout the region. And so we have about $500 million for implementation funds to fund projects that really align with that vision of economic transition in each region, and really also touch on some of the criteria for the core values for our program, such as equity, such as job quality and access to those who haven't had them, as well as moving our climate in the right direction. So the SERF regions where we've did in partnership with the Labor Market Information Division. We had a number of analyses that looked at different definitions of regional economies. We put out for public comment. Here is a snapshot of the different regions, as well as kind of a list of where the different counties fall. I'll move on to kind of some of the different key roles in the planning phase. So we have the actual team of teams, which represents the planning table and different entities from across the region. That's called the High Road Transition Collaborative. We have a convener role that would be applying to this Part 1 grant to be able to bring together different entities for that inclusive planning, to oversee that research, put together the blueprint. And then we also kind of set it up so that two entities can apply together, given the reporting and fiscal requirements. We understand that there might be an entity such as a nonprofit that might not have the fiscal history or capability. And so having two organizations apply together to have a fiscal agent handling the funds, as well as the convener organization that might be ideally suited for the organizing involved, makes a lot of sense. And I've run a nonprofit before, so I know all about the fiscal sponsor and all of the challenges of the day-to-day of running a nonprofit. And then we have coordinators. Those will be hired from the hired or contracted from the convener organization. Here's just a quick snapshot of some of the analysis that we'll be looking at. We'll be looking at what's the state of play in the region, especially as it relates to labor markets, as well as where is the region's economy going? What are some different emerging industries that we have? And really, with all the analysis that we'll require, we really have the lens of job quality, sustainability, and equity going into that plan, into some of these targets for the region. And so here's a couple of highlights on our timeline, and this is where I want to get into some of the legislative updates that we've had. So I mentioned at the top of the program that we were funded by the American Rescue Plan Act. which was excellent, but it also provided us with some really tight timelines and some very restrictive ways, and so how we could use the funds for the program. And so in the junior budget bill that was passed on the 7th of, or maybe 15th, sometime in the first couple of weeks of February, passed both houses and was signed by the governor. What this did was move our funds, our $600 million from the American Rescue Plan Act to offset local tax revenues, and then took $600 million from the general fund to pay for our program. And what this does is give us some more flexibility, and when we can kind of encumber the funds, it gives us a longer runway for that, for putting this program together. And it also provides a little bit of more flexibility with how funds can be spent to really align with the original intent of the program. And so with that, we've already put out a series of guidelines, or excuse me, public comment on our first guidelines. We're going to be putting out a second round of public comment on extended guidelines given those changes. We plan to put out the final solicitation for the planning phase in about May or June. And so those are some of our updates, and I will stop there. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mary. So I know we're going to field some questions here for you. I actually have one for you. So I know there are many regional clusters that are currently organizing around SURF, as well as the K-16 collaborative. And, for example, you've got IEGO out in the Inland Empire, who's working and partnering with a whole host of different organizations in the region, from institutions to business, and government. When we saw that the K-16 collaborative was going to be using the SURF regions as its parameters on how they were going to fund it, many started to think, or at least question, like, how much is the SURF and K-16 collaborative efforts going to overlap, or how does the state maybe even see those two programs working together? If that's a fair question to ask.
Yeah, that's a very, very fair question. It's something that we're actively discussing and meeting on actually later today to see how we can align our programs, especially as we are trying to shift toward regional thinking for planning for some of these large structural changes that are coming our way in our economy. Really organizing these tables so that they can access different funding, different programs, and trying to make sure that we have similar definitions moving forward. And so that's something that we're going to be working on with a number of other different programs too, that might not even overlap neatly with our regional definitions, but I think it's something that's really really important to do. And so I don't have many specifics for you right now, because we are meeting with the folks at K-16 later, but it's something that we're really keen to do to make sure we're aligned.
I appreciate that, Mary. It's all moving so fast, right? I mean, there's so much information coming out, what feels like on a weekly, if not bi-weekly basis on that. So I appreciate you answering that. Lucy, anything on your end for Mary at the moment?
Yes, Mary, you mentioned the Office of Community Partnerships and Strategic Communications at the very beginning of your, and I appreciate that you brought it up. I don't think nonprofits really understand how it applies to us, and how, we'd love to know so that we can be engaged in shaping it. So any information that you have, or a place you can point us in the direction of to find out more. I did post one press release that I just came upon while you were talking, but I think nonprofits would love to know more. I know that's not what we brought you in here to talk about, so it's okay if you don't want to respond, but anything you can give us would be great.
Sure. So this is a proposal in the governor's budget. Part of the rationale, and I'll first say that this is not my particular area of expertise. It's under OPR, and so I've been paying attention to it because of my past history with nonprofits and interest in it. And so I'll say a few things, but not get into great detail. With the census, with the COVID outreach, all across the executive branch and legislative branch as well. There was a lot of really structured outreach to community organizations across the state to help get people vaccinated, to help with the census. And there was this real infrastructure that was created. And, nonprofits, often are so spread thin, right? That being able to connect easily with the state government, being able to have that real structured approach and engagement, it is something, and to be able to continue that for in the future. And so what I can do is connect with you offline, because it might be nice to do another presentation on that, and I will put some information in the chat with respect to how to reach out to OPR. But I know there's 65 million proposed to create this new office that would really structure engagement with CBOs and nonprofits across the state.
Thank you.
All right. And I realized that I threw a wrench in this whole thing when I said K16 Collaborative, and I'm seeing things jump in here just real quick, high level. It is another program that the governor's office is rolling out. The SURF, as Mary had mentioned, is a $600 million investment. The K16 Collaborative is about $250 million. Similar concept, right? Regional clusters. However, the K16 Collaborative is hyper-focused on building out professional pathways that really do bring in the K16. So it is the K-12 plus higher ed, including businesses around the economic development side of things, on how we build that out across the state. And so it'll align in some fashion, as I mentioned earlier with the SURF, right? There will be the various applications from the different regions throughout the states that align with SURF funding. So that was the point of the question. So I apologize if I confused anybody. So we are now done with the presentations of everything. So I don't know if we can bring back all of our panelists on the screen with Jennifer and Essie, along with Mary here. And I'm sure Lucy's going to stick around with me and just answer some questions. We've got about 10, 11 minutes here to answer some questions that you all may have. And I'm going to look here in the chat and the Q&A. Lucy, if you see of anything, feel free to throw them in.
I'll jump in while you're looking.
All right.
Jennifer, in your search of bills, have you come across anything that relates to the reform of donor advised funds? And you might want to say a word about what they are too, if you would.
Sure. I'm going to ask if you can hear me before I answer. Okay. Yeah, so Cal Nonprofits has actually been involved over the last several years in efforts with Assemblymember Buffy Wicks to try to increase transparency and the pace of funding getting out from what are called donor advised funds, which are funds that are primarily housed by either community foundations or commercial entities like Vanguard, Fidelity, or Schwab, wherein a donor typically puts money in at the end of the year and then has, it turns out under the federal and state law, kind of an unlimited amount of to do, good work in communities. And we would like to see those funds move faster, and we'd like to have a better handle on what those funds are. So right now there is not a bill pending in the state legislature. I think it's still possible that Ms. Wicks will decide to act on that this year. The federal ACE Act is pending, which Cal Nonprofits strongly supports, because the real fix for this is probably at the federal level, while the state doesn't have to conform and could go its own way. We would much prefer a federal approach as well. But I would just comment for those interested in this topic that on Cal Nonprofits homepage right now is a link to some draft principles for philanthropic reform that goes to a bit of this issue. And if you're interested, please weigh in and give us feedback on that. That would also help inform our future legislative efforts.
In the last couple of years, the governor's office, and this could really go to any three of you, the governor's office has been able to use his executive office to streamline a lot of the budgetary items and not really utilizing much of the legislature. I mean, of course, in partnership, but because we were in pandemic mode, right, there were certain there were certain actions that were able to be taken to expedite some of these processes. Do we anticipate that happening again this year? I mean, if we are indeed going into an endemic mode, how much of that do we still see happening this time around? And as I said at the top of the hour, do we truly see many of the budget and bill items being inundated with some COVID-19 precautions, as we're looking at hopefully ending out a three-year spell here? Anyone who wants to take that one? It's a long question.
I'll take a stab at that. Again, not speaking definitively, but just my opinion. I think you probably will still see, whether through the budget, not this year, probably maybe next year too, and other legislative efforts, probably will still see some ways that folks are trying to continue to address the pandemic, even though we're in the endemic phase. There's we know that different communities across California really were impacted disproportionately by COVID, and there's some. It's still here with us, and people are still struggling. So I imagine that legislators and the governor's administration will still try to continue to address, hopefully continue to address the still ongoing reality of both the pandemic and its effects on individuals and communities. And then also, as I noted, one of the ways for proposals to sort of comply with the Gan Limit is if they are sort of COVID-19 emergency related. So that might be more incentive for folks to try and figure out how to have their proposals deal with COVID-19, perhaps more explicitly than they otherwise might have. But that's my guess.
Well, Effie, I've got a different question for you. And I know that we are really focused on state level policy, but we have a question about how the state budget may impact county budgets. So I don't know if there's anything you want to say about that. You can also decline if you choose.
Was there? Sorry, I'm trying to find it in the chat or the Q&A. Was there a specific aspect that person?
No, it wasn't looking at a subsector of it was just generally, if there's anything you want to say about how that process works. And maybe a related question is,
Mary wants to go.
yeah, let's segue. Can somebody explain BCPs and kind of change proposals that state agencies are making?
Well, Mary had her hand up real quick, so I'm going to let her go, and then we'll see what she says. And I'll come up if I need to.
No, I didn't mean to jump in line, Essie, but I had a response regarding the just a kind of specific example regarding your first question on local budgets, and that is regarding our kind of different transitions that we have economically right now. There is a $450 million proposal in the governor's budget for a local sustainability fund that would help areas that are really contingent on certain industries for their local tax revenues that might be shifting their economy. And so this is to help support them in times of economic change. And this is under a GoBiz. So I just wanted to share that that's a specific proposal to really help local governments in times of economic change that we're going to be seeing over the next few decades.
And then, yeah, broadly speaking, I'll try to provide more maybe resources in the chat that I can think of. Yeah, there's a myriad ways where the states and counties, their budgets sort of interact. Sometimes that might be state spending in the budget isn't necessarily doesn't necessarily have to be for just sort of state programs. That funding can also go to localities themselves directly, or a state program can then sort of create kind of like a local mandate at the county level. But sort of without a more specific question, it's a bit harder for me to respond. And I think Was the second part, was it someone just asking what a budget change proposal is, or?
Yes, I think it would be good for folks to know what that is.
Yeah, just as like a basic definition, when an agency or department or entity sort of puts forward a proposal to revise beyond their current authorized level of service, or if they want to create a program or eliminate a program, then they submit this BCP budget change proposal, and that has to be approved by the governor and submitted to the legislature, and they'll be posted on the Department of Finance website.
Awesome. Thank you, Essie. Oh, go ahead, Mary.
Add on to yes, and to Essie, I was going to say it's often affiliated with legislation, but sometimes we have to submit BCPs to the Department of Finance. Let's say if we need staff or some just kind of changes like that are a little bit less sexy, but help us get our job done.
Yeah. Now there's like 2 minutes left. I know we got to get Laura back in here to help us round this out, but I do want to ask one more question in like the next 45 seconds. Redistricting, right? We all know that budget asks and legislative or policy asks all tend to, impact regions and their districts, but now the districts are going to be changing after this election year. How do you all see the makeup of those bills and budget asks changing, and how much of those do you actually see going through that are going to be very district specific, for the coming election year? I don't know if that question was a little messy, but
I'm not sure I can answer the question the way you posed it, but I'm happy to comment. I think I would love to add to what you said at the outset that I am excited about the opportunity that redistricting can provide to have community voices more reflective sort of in the makeup of the districts, and not just a potential of access, of finding more people of color here at the Capitol, but women as well. I think there are a lot of exciting candidates. I think for nonprofits in district, a lot of these candidates are people that we don't, right? They haven't sought statewide office before, but they might be your city council member, they might be your county supervisor or your school board members. And boy, are we going to be counting on some introductions from all of you, because upwards of like a quarter of the legislature is expected to be new come, January of next year. So I think there's a lot of, I'm excited about the opportunity to engage with a lot of new faces and new ideas. I'd say this year, Julian, the impact is more about the resignations and kind of the, I'm curious to see if various members vote more of their conscience rather than worrying about having to vote to get reelected in some way. Some of them are pursuing other offices. So I think it's possible that we don't see a lot of changes, but some are, you can see right now, are tacking left or tacking right, depending on what they're facing in their other campaigns. And so it's adding a bit of mystery to how votes, I think, will go this year. And I do think it's probably affected what their bill packages are and what their budget sort of things they're going to champion for earmarks or things in the budget this year. But I think it's still really playing out, and it's keeping advocates and lobbyists on their toes.
It's going to keep all of us on our toes, right? Well, thank you all so much. This was amazing. And I am going to hand it back out to Laura to close us out.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you to all of you for spending your Tuesday morning with us, learning about how this legislative and budget session is shaping up, and also what we might expect with some of these one-time investments coming through from the federal and state relief funds like the SURF program. If you're here today, you will get an email in the next few days with the recording, the slides, resources that you saw coming through fast and furious, as someone described in the chat box. This will go out to all registered participants, but it's also linked from the Cal Nonprofits website, where you will also find recordings of all of our past California Policy Forum roundtables, including sessions that we've run just in the last year or so on the budget process, on legislative advocacy, on redistricting, and much more. Thank you to our wonderful speakers, to our moderator, to the California Policy Forum partners, and of course our awesome tech team, but most importantly to all of you, the hundreds of social sector leaders who took time out of their morning to build our sector's collective capacity around public policy advocacy. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll see you at the next California Policy Forum.